Hello everyone. So I wanted to start the lecture today by just explaining that I'm sorry if the sound quality is a bit worse in these lectures coming up, as I have misplaced my headphones with my microphone that I usually use to record, so sorry about that. In today's lecture we will be examining the background to the various schemes of federation, which means the uniting of different countries together into one mega country, that were designed in Europe and for the world. This lecture serves as a wider introduction to the topic of European integration and the European Union. The Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean, the Balkans, France, and Britain for a period of hundreds of years. Thanks to Rome, Europe received a shared language, Latin, as well as becoming better linked thanks to Roman infrastructure. Many Europeans were dispersed throughout the empire thanks to Roman imperialism. Nubian soldiers from the south of Egypt, for example, were sent as far afield as Scotland. We should also not think that the collapse of Rome was inevitable. China was not united too much earlier than Rome, but remained united for thousands of years, despite enduring numerous civil wars, and the Han Chinese culture managed to convert barbarians into standard Chinese. Rome was, however, unable to do the same, and the glory and unity of the Roman Empire became a passing memory. One legacy that remained when Rome fell was the Christian Church, which also existed beyond the borders of Europe's petty kingdoms and principalities. Church figures in Rome, in northern France, in Iberia, etc., all continued to communicate and work together in a fairly centralized system under the Pope. Although the Church did not officially seize temporal power outside of monastic states such as Cologne, in reality it was an extremely strong force in European politics. Moreover, culturally, Church figures created numerous works of art and history that kept a standardized European identity alive. The separation with the Eastern Orthodox Church in the 11th century was a blow to what was now the Roman Catholic Church, but on the other hand it ensured that the city of Rome remained the spiritual and cultural center of Europe for centuries until the Protestant Reformation. George of Poděbrady was the king of Bohemia, which is the homeland of the Czechs, in the middle years of the 15th century. Now George was a Hussite, which was an early form of Protestantism that emerged in Bohemia before the wider Protestant Reformation broke out. He was elected king by the Bohemian nobles, as he promised to throw off the rule of the hated Austrian Habsburgs, if you can remember them. In order to win support against the Habsburgs and get the Pope off of his back, with heresy being taken rather seriously in medieval Europe, George made a radical suggestion. He proposed one common European organization with a parliament that would settle disputes between the different European countries. He sent his brother-in-law round to the different courts of Europe with this proposal. George's plans were largely ignored, and the Pope in the end launched a crusade against Bohemia, with the country eventually falling to a Hungarian invasion. So let us jump forward about 200 years to 17th century North America. Here we zoom in on an Englishman, William Penn, who founded the province of Pennsylvania, which was named after his father. Like much of the leadership of early Pennsylvania and the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, Penn was a devout Quaker. The Quakers were a pacifist religious order who believed that mankind should be united, not divided. Penn called for all of Europe's North American colonies to unite together, as they eventually did 70 years after his death, as the USA. He also proposed a United States of Europe through the establishment of a single European Parliament, which, like that of George of Bohemia, would solve disputes between the different states. For all of his later importance, however, Penn was largely ignored in his lifetime, and was even sent to the Tower of London for opposing the authority of King William. Another hero of American independence, the Marquis de Lafayette, also proposed a United States of Europe 100 years after Penn did. Tadeusz Kosciuszko also supported a European Union using the US model as an example. Significant differences remained, however, between the Europe and the US. Most notably, Europeans spoke a bewildering array of languages, whereas in the US, English was dominant. The European elite spoke French, but the language of commerce was increasingly Dutch, or even English, and common people spoke only local dialects. Secondly, Europeans had spent the last 1,500 years fighting each other non-stop, whereas violent conflicts between the 13 colonies, whilst they did happen, had been rare. Lastly, the revolutionaries, who proposed a United States of Europe, were often opposed to the Catholic Church, perhaps the one institution that could have pulled most of the European states together. Napoleon, as we have seen, attempted to spread the ideals of the French Revolution to the rest of Europe via force of arms. In this sense, he was carrying on the tradition of the Roman Empire, and indeed many Roman symbols, such as the eagle, were used by Napoleon's forces. France's military was welcomed by many Europeans for its promises of enlightenment and equality that the revolution espoused. However, particularly during Napoleon's time in power, French rule was often repressive and severe. Rather than uniting Europe, Napoleon expanded France and French power. He made no attempts to share power equally between, say, French, Germans, and Spaniards. The continental system of commerce set up by France was less an attempt to create economic union than a French scheme to make sure Europeans brought French rather than British goods. Napoleon's British enemy, meanwhile, directly sought to prevent any unification of Europe, fearing that the resulting superstate could easily outmatch the British Empire in economic and military power. French author and pacifist Victor Hugo called for a United States of Europe at an international peace conference held in 1849. Unlike Napoleon, Hugo called for Europe to be united via peaceful means. He said, "A war between Europeans is a civil war," and planted an oak of the United States of Europe in his garden on the island of Guernsey, itself both British and French culturally. Unfortunately for Hugo, whilst the rest of the 19th century was largely peaceful, it was not an atmosphere of brotherhood and unity that prevailed, but rather manic ultra-nationalism. Multinational states, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were the exception, not the norm, and were widely derived as outmoded relics of the past. Some German nationalists sought to unify much of Europe around German dominance. This idea of Mitteleuropa, or Middle Europe, proposed that German culture was neither Western or Asian, but was rather its own distinct system. Some German intellectuals called for all Germans living between the Netherlands and Ukraine to be united into one superstate. The other peoples, unfortunate enough to be living in this area, such as the Poles, were to be made subservient to the more cultured Germans. Calls for a Middle Europe grew more extreme during the First World War. Friedrich Naumann, a German thinker, called for a massive German Reich that would Germanize its subject peoples. The German High Command drew up grand plans for annexing parts of Europe, as seen in action at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Bolsheviks in 1918. Germany, however, lost the war. The victorious Allies were divided between their desires to increase their own national power and their want to create a system to prevent such a destructive war from ever occurring again. The League of Nations was proposed by the US President Woodrow Wilson as a means of settling disputes between different nations. Although the League was designed as a worldwide organization, it is fair to say that Wilson was far more interested in helping the white nations of Europe than the people of Asia and Africa. Today, the League of Nations is widely mocked for having failed to prevent World War II. Not only did the USA not even join, the two major powers in the League, France and the UK, had massive empires that they refused to give up. However, at the time, the League was truly a revolutionary idea and did, in the 1920s, solve a number of disputes, such as between Finland and Sweden over the Åland Islands in the Baltic Sea. Both Victor Hugo's Europe and the League of Nations were liberal ideals based on middle-class and cosmopolitan cooperation. Middle Europe, meanwhile, was outrightly authoritarian and proto-fascist. Socialists rejected both of these ideals. Marx and Engels had famously declared in their Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world unite," and in the late 19th century, numerous European socialists did cooperate with one another. Socialists met together in great conferences under the so-called First and Second Internationals. Socialist revolutionaries believed that a revolution that broke out in only one country was doomed to fail. Rather, workers in London, Paris, and Berlin would all have to work together to overthrow capitalism and imperialism. Dreams of socialist cooperation, however, were crushed when socialists supported their country's war aims during World War I. Following this war, the socialist movement would be incredibly fractured. Communists, who were more united than social democrats, largely took their orders from the Soviet Union, and at times it appeared that their role was more to enhance Soviet power than it was to continue the cause of world revolution. Aristide Briand was a French foreign minister in the 1920s who sought to reconcile Europe's different nations after the chaos of the World War. France had originally, under Georges Clemenceau, pursued a very nationalist and anti-German policy, understandable when you consider the immense amount of damage caused in the country during the war. However, this only exacerbated and deepened the hatred between French and Germans. Briand received the 1926 Nobel Peace Prize together with Gustav Stresemann of Germany for the work both did with one another. Briand proposed a European Union in a speech at the League of Nations in 1929. Whilst none of his proposals for political and economic cooperation were enacted, his statements that French security depended on a stable, cooperative international system were not to be forgotten and were resuscitated after the Second World War. In the meantime, German ideals of Reich and Middle Europe reached their genocidal conclusion under Hitler. Had Germany won the Second World War, Europe was to be ruled via a racial hierarchy, with Germans, the top, entirely dominant. Nazi Europe would most likely have continued to oppress Africa for raw materials, whilst the lands of Eastern Europe would have been slowly and violently converted into a German agricultural zone. As we have seen, German violence and refusal to work with other nations left many European fascists feeling betrayed and disillusioned. Meanwhile, Hitler built up Europe's largest army, consisting of forces from numerous countries, in order to invade the Soviet Union. This army was, however, crushed, much like Napoleon's Grand European Army had been in 1812. Not only would Germany not dominate Europe, but the country itself was now divided so as to never pose a threat to peace again. In the meantime, people in the USA came to believe that their country could no longer hide from the world in isolation, but instead had to play a proactive role in world security. President Franklin Roosevelt worked with Stalin and Prime Minister Churchill to arrange a post-war world meant to be free of the oppressive empires of the past. The result was the United Nations, an organization which, like the League of Nations, was designed to coordinate disputes between the world's states. Quickly, the UN became gridlocked between US and Soviet interests as the Cold War developed. Nonetheless, for all its flaws, the UN represented the first effective international organization and encouraged trends of decolonization and eventually demilitarization. Over time, the idea of a united Europe slowly became more and more accepted. Whereas traditionally, European Union had been espoused by only a tiny strata of intellectuals, by the 19th century, international organizations emerged envisioning a number of different European federations. At the same time as the idealists created elaborate plans for unity, militarists conquered parts of Europe by force, the same way ancient Rome had once done. Both Napoleon and Hitler, however, failed to conquer Britain and Russia, and so their dreams never reached fruition. Moreover, French rule, and especially Nazi German rule, was unpopular, and unification often lost out to military expediency.